The day I walked into my own funeral and saw my best friend of 60 years delivering my eulogy was the day I realized Beatrice Williams had been systematically stealing pieces of my life for decades. My name is Florence Agnes Whitmore. I'm 82 years old and I've been legally dead for 3 days. Not actually dead, that would be inconvenient, but dead according to the state of Oregon, dead according to my bank accounts, and dead according to the 300 people currently sitting in Riverside Baptist Church, listening to Beatrice tell them what a wonderful person I was. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd driven to Portland from my cabin in Bend because my neighbor had called to tell me there was some kind of emergency involving my affairs. What I found when I arrived was my own memorial service, complete with a closed casket, elaborate flower arrangements, and Beatrice standing at the podium wearing my mother's pearl necklace, the one I'd supposedly lost 2 years ago. Florence was the most generous person I ever knew, Beatrice was saying, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief as she gazed out at the mourners. She gave everything to everyone. Her time, her money, her love. She was like a sister to me. I stood in the back of the church, wearing dark sunglasses and a headscarf I'd grabbed from my car, watching this macabre performance and trying to understand what I was seeing. The program in my hands had my photograph on the front, my high school graduation picture from 1958, and inside, a full biography of my life that was startlingly accurate except for one crucial detail. According to this program, I had died of a heart attack in my sleep at Mercy General Hospital 3 days ago. According to this program, Beatrice Williams had been named as my closest living relative and the executor of my estate. According to this program, I had requested a simple service followed by cremation, except I wasn't dead. I was standing in the back of my own funeral, very much alive, watching my best friend since childhood bury me so she could inherit my life. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Beatrice wasn't just delivering my eulogy, she was stealing my death. And if she was willing to kill me off legally, what else had she taken from me over the years? I thought about the peculiar string of coincidences that had brought me to this moment. The sudden urge to get away from it all that had led me to buy a remote cabin in Bend 6 months ago. The insistence that I needed peace and quiet to recover from what Beatrice had convinced me was early-stage dementia. The way she'd gradually taken over managing my affairs, my mail and my medical appointments. The way she'd isolated me from everyone else in my life while positioning herself as my primary caregiver and closest confidant. Florence always said she wanted to be remembered simply. Beatrice continued. And I noticed she was wearing my wedding ring, the one I'd supposedly misplaced after my husband died 5 years ago. She didn't want a fuss made over her passing. She just wanted to know that her memory would live on in the hearts of those who loved her. Memory. That was the key, wasn't it? For the past year, Beatrice had been gently suggesting that my memory was failing, that I was becoming confused, and that I couldn't be trusted to manage my own affairs. She'd convinced me to give her power of attorney just in case. She'd convinced me to add her name to my bank accounts for convenience. She'd convinced me that I was losing my mind when, in fact, she'd been systematically gaslighting me while stealing my identity. Now, apparently she'd decided to skip the slow dissolution of my life and just end it outright. The service concluded with a hymn I'd never particularly liked. And I watched as people filed past the closed casket, my closed casket, offering condolences to Beatrice, who accepted them with the appropriate mixture of grief and gratitude. I recognized most of the faces, my neighbors from the house I'd lived in for 30 years before Beatrice convinced me to downsize to the cabin. Former colleagues from my career as a librarian, members of the book club I'd belonged to for 15 years before Beatrice suggested I take a break because the discussions were getting too stressful for my condition. One by one, Beatrice had removed these people from my life, convincing me that they were causing me anxiety, that I needed less stimulation, and that isolation was therapeutic for someone with my cognitive issues. What I'd thought was dementia had actually been the systematic destruction of my social connections, my independence, and my identity. What I'd thought was my best friend helping me through a difficult time had actually been a methodical theft of everything that made me who I was. After the service, I followed the crowd to the cemetery, maintaining my distance while watching Beatrice play the part of the grieving pseudo-daughter. She'd positioned herself as my de facto next of kin, since I'd never had children, and my few remaining relatives lived across the country. At the graveside, she threw the first handful of dirt on my empty coffin and whispered, "Goodbye, old friend. I'll take good care of everything you left behind, everything I left behind. My house, which I'd deeded to her 6 months ago when she'd convinced me I needed to simplify my affairs. My life insurance policy, which listed her as the beneficiary because she'd convinced me my distant relatives didn't need the money. My savings, my possessions, my entire existence, all of it now legally belonged to the woman who'd spent the last year convincing me I was losing my mind. But I wasn't losing my mind. I was standing at my own graveside, very much alive, finally understanding the scope of what had been done to me. After the funeral, I drove back to my cabin in Bend, with my hand shaking on the steering wheel, trying to process what I'd witnessed. For 62 years, I'd believed Beatrice Williams was my closest friend. Now I had to confront the possibility that she'd been playing a long game of theft and manipulation that had culminated in my legal murder. I sat in my small kitchen that night, surrounded by the sparse furnishings I'd moved with when Beatrice convinced me to simplify my life, and tried to trace back when this had all started. Beatrice and I had met in 2nd grade at Woodrow Wilson Elementary School in Salem, Oregon in 1946. We'd been inseparable through school, college roommates at Oregon State, each other's bridesmaids, and godmothers to each other's children. Except I'd never had children. While Beatrice had raised 3 who'd all moved to different states and rarely called, or so she'd told me. Now I wondered, had Beatrice's children really drifted away from her? Or had she driven them away the same way she'd isolated me from my friends and family? I began to think about specific incidents over the years, moments that had seemed like friendship, but might have been something else entirely. 87. I'd been offered a promotion at the library that would have required relocating to Eugene. Beatrice had convinced me to turn it down, saying she couldn't bear to lose her best friend, that Salem needed me more. I'd stayed, touched by her loyalty. But now I wondered, had she been protecting our friendship or preventing me from building a new life where she couldn't control me? 1995. My mother had died and left me her house and a significant inheritance. Beatrice had been incredibly helpful during the probate process, recommending lawyers and financial advisors who, she said, were the best in town. Within a year, most of my inheritance was in investments that performed poorly. Had she been helping me, or had she steered me toward people who would help her gain access to my money? 2003. I'd started dating Gerald Whitmore, a kind widower who'd recently retired from the Postal Service. Beatrice had immediately found fault with him. He was too old, too set in his ways, and not good enough for me. But when I'd married him anyway, she'd seemed to accept it. Gerald died in 2018 after 15 happy years together, and Beatrice had been my primary source of comfort during my grief. But now I remembered things differently. How she'd gradually encouraged me to see Gerald's quirks as flaws. How she'd suggested that his memory problems might be hereditary, and how she'd planted seeds of doubt about my own mental acuity. Had she been preparing me, even then, for the gaslighting that would come later? 2019. The year after Gerald died, I'd started having episodes of confusion and forgetfulness that worried me deeply. Beatrice had been the one who'd suggested I see a doctor, had driven me to appointments, and had been present for every conversation with medical professionals. She'd been the one who'd interpreted the test results, explained the diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment, and suggested the lifestyle changes that would help me manage my condition. But what if there had never been a diagnosis? What if the doctors I'd met with weren't real doctors at all, but people Beatrice had hired to convince me I was losing my mind? The more I thought about it, the more plausible it seemed. I'd been so grateful to have someone managing my medical care, so relieved that Beatrice was handling the complicated insurance paperwork and medication schedules. I'd never thought to ask for copies of my medical records or speak to my doctors independently. I'd trusted her completely, and she'd used that trust to convince me I couldn't trust my own mind. The systematic nature of it was breathtaking. Over the course of 3 years, Beatrice had convinced me I had dementia and needed constant supervision, isolated me from friends, family, and community connections, gained access to my finances through power of attorney, moved me to a remote location where I had no support system, gradually taken possession of my most valuable belongings, and finally, faked my death so she could inherit everything I owned. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed I would stay isolated in Bend, that I would never venture back to Portland, and that I would never discover what she'd done. She hadn't counted on Mrs. Peterson, my neighbor in Bend, calling to tell me about the emergency in Portland that required my immediate attention. Mrs. Peterson, it turned out, had received a call from someone claiming to be from my lawyer's office, asking about my whereabouts because there were urgent matters to discuss regarding my estate. Beatrice had probably intended for me to never learn about my own death. She'd likely planned to let me live out my remaining years in isolation while she enjoyed the benefits of inheriting my life. But someone, maybe one of her accomplices, maybe a legitimate lawyer trying to contact me, had inadvertently tipped me off. Now I knew the truth, but what could I do about it? How do you prove you're alive when someone has convinced the world you're dead? How do you reclaim your life when your best friend has stolen your identity? And more importantly, how do you come back from the dead without destroying the elaborate lie that had given your murderer everything you once owned? I spent that night making lists. People Beatrice had convinced me to avoid, possessions she'd helped me relocate, and financial decisions she'd guided me through. The scope of her betrayal was staggering, but it was also systematic enough that there had to be evidence. If I was going to expose what Beatrice had done, if I was going to reclaim my life and my identity, I needed proof. And I needed to be very, very careful about how I went about getting it, because if Beatrice Williams was willing to kill me legally to steal my life, she might be willing to kill me actually if she discovered I was still alive. The next morning I did something I hadn't done in months. I drove to Salem and visited my old house, the house where I'd lived for 30 years, where Gerald and I had been happy, and where I'd planned to spend the rest of my life before Beatrice convinced me it was too much responsibility for someone with my condition. I parked across the street at 7 a.m. before the current occupants would be up and stared at the blue Victorian I'd bought in 1990 with money from my mother's estate. The house I'd lovingly restored, room by room, over 3 decades. The house I'd signed over to Beatrice 6 months ago for $1 and other valuable considerations, because she'd convinced me I needed to protect my assets from the costs of long-term care. There were new curtains in the front windows and a different car in the driveway, but otherwise, it looked exactly as I'd left it. My garden was still thriving, better than thriving, actually. Someone was taking excellent care of the roses I'd planted in memory of my mother. As I sat there, a woman emerged from the front door to get the newspaper. She was about my age, with silver hair and a confident stride that reminded me of myself 20 years ago. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. Then it hit me. This was Margaret Chen, the woman I'd briefly met at Beatrice's church last year. Beatrice had introduced her as a new friend who was looking for a nice place to live. At the time, I thought it was sweet that Beatrice was helping her find housing. Now I realized I'd been introduced to the woman who would be living in my house. The entire transaction had been planned months in advance. Beatrice hadn't just convinced me to deed her my house on impulse. She'd already identified who would be living there and had probably already arranged the sale before I'd even signed the papers. I waited until Margaret went back inside, then drove to the Multnomah County Courthouse to begin investigating the paper trail of my own destruction. The records were all there, filed neatly and legally. The power of attorney documents are dated 18 months ago. The deed transfer is dated 6 months ago. The will I'd supposedly signed 3 months ago, leaving everything to Beatrice in recognition of her devoted care and friendship. But as I examined the documents more closely, I noticed something interesting. My signatures didn't look quite right. I'd been a librarian for 35 years. I'd spent decades examining documents, verifying authenticity, and catching discrepancies that others missed. And the signatures on these legal documents, while close, weren't quite correct. The way I dotted my E's, the slant of my capital F, and the distinctive loop I made in the W of Whitmore, they were similar, but not identical. Someone had been practicing my signature, getting close enough to fool casual inspection, but not close enough to fool someone who knew what to look for. I requested copies of everything and spent the afternoon comparing the forged signatures to legitimate examples from my library employment records. The differences were subtle but consistent. Whoever had forged these documents was skilled but not perfect. That evening, I visited the law office of Hamilton, Baker & Associates, the firm that had supposedly handled my estate planning. The receptionist was polite but confused when I asked to speak with the attorney who'd drafted my will. "I'm sorry," she said, "but we don't have any record of a Florence Whitmore. Are you sure you have the right firm?" "The will was prepared by James Hamilton," I said, showing her the document. She looked at it carefully, then shook her head. "Ma'am, I've worked here for 15 years, and Mr. Hamilton has been dead for 8 years. This document is definitely not from our office. The law firm was fake. The will was fake. The entire legal framework that had transferred my assets to Beatrice was an elaborate forgery. But here's what I couldn't understand. How had she managed to get the documents officially filed and recorded if they were fake? How had she convinced banks and government offices to accept forged papers? The answer came to me as I was driving back to Bend. She'd had help. This wasn't a one-woman operation. Beatrice had accomplices, people inside the system who could make fake documents appear legitimate, who could process transfers without proper verification, and who could manipulate official records. This was bigger than just one woman stealing from her elderly friend. This was an organized scheme, possibly targeting multiple victims, using sophisticated document forgery and insider corruption to steal from vulnerable seniors. And I was probably not Beatrice's only victim. Back at my cabin, I did something I should have done months ago. I called my actual doctor. Not the specialists Beatrice had arranged for me to see, but Dr. Sarah Martinez, who'd been my physician for 10 years before Beatrice convinced me I needed more specialized care. Florence. Dr. Martinez sounded genuinely surprised to hear from me. "I've been wondering what happened to you. You missed your last 3 appointments, and when I called your house, the number was disconnected. Dr. Martinez, I need to ask you something very important. Do I have dementia?" There was a long pause. "Dementia? Florence, why would you think you have dementia? Your cognitive function has always been excellent. In fact, you're one of my sharpest patients. But what about the tests? The diagnosis? The specialists you referred me to?" "Florence, I never referred you to any specialists for cognitive issues. The last time I saw you, about 8 months ago, You were in excellent health for someone your age. You mentioned some concerns about memory, but that's normal aging, not dementia. 8 months ago, right around the time Beatrice had started managing my medical care, filtering my communications with Dr. Martinez, and gradually transitioning me to the fake specialists who'd provided the fake diagnosis that justified everything that came after. Dr. Martinez, I said, I need to see you as soon as possible, and I need you to document everything about my medical history, my cognitive status, and my capacity to make my own decisions. Of course. Florence, are you in some kind of trouble? Yes, I said, but I'm going to get out of it. That night, I started putting together a plan, not just to expose what Beatrice had done to me, but to uncover the full scope of what appeared to be an organized operation targeting elderly people. If they'd done this to me, they'd almost certainly done it to others. But first, I needed to stay alive long enough to gather evidence. Because if Beatrice discovered I was still breathing, she might decide that legal murder wasn't enough. She might decide to try the real thing. My appointment with Dr. Martinez confirmed what I'd suspected. I was completely healthy, both physically and mentally. She conducted a thorough cognitive assessment and documented that I showed no signs of dementia. Confusion or impairment of any kind. Florence, she said after completing her examination, your mental acuity is exceptional, better than most people half your age. Whoever told you that you had dementia was either grossly incompetent or deliberately lying to you. Armed with official documentation of my competence, I began investigating the network that had made my legal murder possible. It wasn't just Beatrice. She'd needed help from people inside the system who could file false documents, process fraudulent transfers, and manipulate official records. My first break came when I visited the Office of Vital Records to see how my death certificate had been processed. The clerk, a tired-looking woman named Janet, was initially defensive when I questioned the documentation. Ma'am, we process hundreds of death certificates every month. We can't verify every detail personally. But don't you require a physician's signature? Medical examiner confirmation? Some kind of verification that the person actually died? Janet looked uncomfortable. Usually, yes. But sometimes, when the paperwork comes from certain sources, the verification process is streamlined. What kind of sources? Well, there are some medical facilities and legal offices that we've worked with for years. When they submit documentation, we don't always require the same level of verification. I asked to see the specific documents related to my death certificate. What I found was fascinating. The paperwork had been submitted by Sunset Manor Care Facility, a place I'd never heard of, and signed by Dr. William Harrison, a physician I'd never met. When I called Sunset Manor, the number was disconnected. When I looked up Dr. William Harrison, I found that he'd died in 2015. Dead doctor, fake facility, fraudulent paperwork. But it had been processed without question because it came from a trusted source. I spent the next week tracing the connections, following the paper trail that led from my fake death to Beatrice's real inheritance. What I discovered was a sophisticated network of corruption involving at least 6 people. Beatrice Williams, the mastermind who identified targets and managed the psychological manipulation. Robert Kim, a lawyer who specialized in fake estate planning documents. 3. Patricia, nurse, a woman who posed as various medical professionals to provide fake diagnoses. James Rivera, a clerk in the county recorder's office who processed fraudulent documents. C. Diana Foster, someone inside the Social Security Administration who could manipulate death records. 6. Marcus Webb, a man who ran several fake medical facilities used as cover for the operation. This wasn't just elder abuse, it was organized crime. And based on what I was finding, I wasn't their only victim. I spent days at the courthouse, the library, and various public records offices, cross-referencing names, dates, and document patterns. What emerged was a picture of systematic exploitation targeting elderly people with significant assets but limited family connections. The pattern was always the same. Identify a lonely senior with money. Build a relationship of trust over months or years. Gradually isolate them from their support systems. Convince them they were mentally impaired, gain legal control of their assets, and finally either wait for them to die naturally or, in extreme cases, kill them off legally while keeping them alive in isolation. I found evidence of at least 12 other cases over the past 5 years. 12 other elderly people who'd been convinced they were losing their minds and who'd signed away their assets to trusted friends who'd turned out to be professional thieves. Some of the victims had actually died, making it impossible to verify whether their deaths were natural. Others, like me, had been moved to remote locations where they could be kept alive, but isolated while their identities were stolen and their assets distributed. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about what they'd done to me. It was about a systematic pattern of destroying vulnerable people's lives for financial gain. But I also realized I was in serious danger. If this network had been operating for years, stealing millions of dollars from dozens of victims, they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate someone who threatened to expose them. I needed help, but I couldn't trust the local authorities. Rivera worked for the county, and Foster worked for Social Security. They had people inside the system who could manipulate records, suppress investigations, and make problems disappear. I needed someone outside the network, someone with the authority and resources to take on organized crime. That's when I decided to contact the FBI. Agent Sarah Chen was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of intense focus that reminded me of myself when I was tracking down obscure research requests at the library. When I called the Portland field office and told her I had information about organized elder fraud, she agreed to meet me immediately. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Portland, and I spread out the evidence I'd gathered: forged documents, fake medical records, fraudulent death certificates, financial transfers, and the network map I'd created showing how all the players were connected. Agent Chen studied the materials for nearly an hour without speaking, occasionally asking clarifying questions or making notes in a small notebook. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said finally, "what you've uncovered is extraordinary. We've been investigating reports of elder fraud in Oregon for 2 years, but we've never seen anything this organized or sophisticated. How many victims?" "Based on your research? Possibly dozens. The financial losses could be in the tens of millions." She looked at me intently. "Mrs. Whitmore, you realize you're in serious danger. If this network discovers you're alive and investigating them, they'll likely try to eliminate you permanently." "I know, but I can't let them keep doing this to people." "What do you want from us?" "I want to help you take them down. All of them. I want to make sure they never steal another person's life." Agent Chen smiled for the first time since we'd met. "Mrs. Whitmore, how would you feel about going undercover?" Going undercover at 82 years old wasn't something I'd ever imagined doing. But Agent Chen's plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would rise from the dead gradually, creating a trail of evidence that would expose the entire network while keeping me safe from retaliation. "We're going to use your legal death as an advantage," she explained during our second meeting at the FBI field office. "Beatrice and her associates think you're safely buried and forgotten. They won't be expecting you to surface with evidence of their crimes." The plan had 3 phases. Phase 1, documentation while maintaining my dead status. I would work with federal investigators to document every aspect of the fraud network. We'd gather evidence, interview other victims, and build an airtight case against all 6 conspirators. Phase 2, controlled resurrection. I would gradually reappear in official records, armed with medical documentation of my competence and legal proof that my death had been fraudulent. This would trigger investigations into how the false records had been filed and processed. Phase 3. Confrontation. Once the case was complete, I would reveal myself to Beatrice and the network, preferably in a controlled environment where federal agents could arrest them simultaneously. The first phase took 6 weeks. Working with Agent Chen and her team, I helped identify 17 other victims of the network's fraud. Some were still alive, isolated in remote locations like I had been, convinced they were dying or mentally impaired. Others had died under suspicious circumstances after signing over their assets. The scope was staggering. Over 5 years, Beatrice's network had stolen more than $30 million from elderly victims across 3 states. They'd perfected a system of psychological manipulation, document forgery, and institutional corruption that had allowed them to operate with impunity. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd left me alive. During those 6 weeks, I lived in a safe house provided by the FBI, emerging only for medical appointments that would establish my continued existence and mental competence. Dr. Martinez provided detailed documentation of my health, while a psychiatrist confirmed that I showed no signs of the dementia that had supposedly justified transferring my assets to Beatrice. The hardest part wasn't the investigation, it was the isolation. After discovering Beatrice's betrayal, I'd lost not just my best friend, but my entire understanding of our 60-year relationship. Every memory was tainted, every moment of apparent friendship now suspect. Had she ever genuinely cared about me, or had I been a mark from the very beginning? Had our college years been real friendship, or had she been studying me even then, learning my vulnerabilities and weaknesses? When she'd comforted me after Gerald's death, had she been motivated by compassion or by the knowledge that grief would make me more susceptible to manipulation? The questions tormented me, but they also strengthened my resolve. Whether our friendship had ever been real or not, what she'd done to me and to 17 other people was unforgivable. In early December, we moved to Phase 2. Agent Chen arranged for me to reappear through a carefully orchestrated series of official interactions. I updated my voter registration, renewed my driver's license, and visited several banks to inquire about accounts that had been closed after my death. Each interaction created official documentation that I was alive, competent, and had never authorized the transfers of my assets. The paper trail of my resurrection began to contradict the paper trail of my death, creating discrepancies that would eventually expose the entire fraud. Meanwhile, federal agents were conducting surveillance on all 6 members of the network. Beatrice was living in a luxury condo in Portland, funded by money she'd stolen from her victims. Robert Kim was still operating his fake law practice, preparing fraudulent estate documents for new targets. Patricia Nurse was working at a legitimate medical facility, using her access to create fake patient records. They were all still active, still targeting new victims, completely unaware that their primary mark was not only alive, but working with federal investigators to expose them. The breakthrough came just before Christmas, when Agent Chen's team intercepted communications between network members discussing a new target, an 85-year-old widow named Dorothy Walsh who'd recently lost her husband and was struggling with grief and isolation. "We need to move now," Agent Chen told me. "They're about to destroy another life, and we can't let that happen." Phase 3 began on December 22, 2023, exactly 3 months after I'd attended my own funeral. The plan was simple but dramatic. I would appear at Beatrice's condo unannounced, wearing a wire, and confront her with evidence of what she'd done. Federal agents would be positioned to arrest her and simultaneously raid the locations of her 5 accomplices. I spent the morning of December 22nd, getting dressed for the most important performance of my life. I wore the blue dress I'd been married in 45 years earlier, the one Beatrice had admired so many times. I wore my mother's pearl necklace, the real one, not the fake Beatrice had been wearing at my funeral. I styled my hair the way I'd worn it in our college photographs, when our friendship had seemed genuine and innocent. I wanted her to see not just Florence Whitmore, the elderly woman she'd manipulated and betrayed, but Florence Agnes Whitmore, the person she'd known for 62 years. I wanted her to understand exactly what she'd destroyed. Agent Chen drove me to Beatrice's building and waited in the lobby while I took the elevator to the 14th floor. The hallway was quiet, expensive, and furnished with the kind of luxury that my stolen money had provided. I stood outside apartment 1407 for a full minute, gathering my courage, thinking about all the victims who couldn't confront their betrayers, all the elderly people who'd died thinking they were losing their minds when they'd actually been losing their lives to professional thieves. Then I rang the doorbell. The door opened, and Beatrice Williams, my best friend for 62 years, the woman who'd delivered my eulogy 3 months ago, stared at me as if she were seeing a ghost, which I suppose she was. "Hello, Beatrice," I said, stepping into her luxury apartment before she could recover from the shock of seeing me alive. "We need to talk." Beatrice Williams, the woman who'd been my closest friend since childhood, who'd systematically destroyed my life, who'd buried me while keeping me alive for her own profit, stood frozen in her doorway wearing the silk robe I'd given her for her 70th birthday. "Florence," she whispered, her face cycling through expressions of shock, fear, and something that might have been guilt. How are you? Alive?" "Yes, I'm alive, Beatrice, despite your best efforts to bury me." I walked into her living room, the living room furnished with money stolen from me and 17 other victims, and settled into the chair that had once sat in my own home. The chair I'd been convinced to give away when I'd downsized to the cabin in Bend. "I don't understand," Beatrice said, still standing by the door as if she might flee. "You died. The funeral. I saw your body. You saw a closed casket, Beatrice. You should know. You arranged the whole charade." I opened my purse and pulled out copies of the forged documents, the fake medical records, and the fraudulent death certificate that had legally ended my existence while keeping me physically alive and isolated. "Sit down," I said, and something in my voice, an authority I'd never used with her before, made her comply. "We're going to discuss what you've done, and you're going to tell me why." For the next 30 minutes, I laid out everything I'd discovered, the systematic manipulation that had convinced me I was losing my mind, the forged signatures that had transferred my assets to her control, the fake doctors and false diagnoses, the network of accomplices who'd made it all possible. Beatrice listened in silence, her face growing paler with each revelation. When I finished, she sat quietly for a long moment, staring at the evidence scattered across her coffee table. "How long have you known?" she asked finally. 3 months? Since the day I attended my own funeral and watched you deliver my eulogy while wearing my mother's necklace." "Florence, Don't you dare try to justify this or explain it away." 62 years, Beatrice. For 62 years I trusted you completely, and you used that trust to steal my entire life. "You don't understand the pressure I was under," she said, her voice taking on the pleading tone she'd once used to convince me I needed her help. "The debts, the medical bills for my mother, the children who never called or visited. I was desperate, so you decided to steal from your best friend? I decided to borrow from you temporarily. The plan was to pay you back, to make investments that would benefit both of us. But then opportunities arose, and the network offered ways to maximize the returns. The network. You mean your criminal associates who helped you forge my signature and fake my death? Beatrice's facade finally cracked. They told me it would be easy, that elderly people like you were forgotten by the system anyway, that no one would miss you if you just disappeared from the official records. No one would miss me? Beatrice, I was your best friend. You were dying anyway. The words exploded out of her with startling vehemence. You were old, alone, and confused. Your quality of life was terrible. I was actually doing you a favor by taking care of the financial complications. I wasn't confused, and I wasn't dying. You convinced me I was confused. You isolated me from everyone who cared about me. You made me believe I was losing my mind when the only thing I was losing was my trust in the wrong person. Florence, please. We can fix this. I can transfer everything back to you. We can tell people there was a mistake with the death certificate, some kind of administrative error. No one has to know about the rest of it. I looked at this woman I'd loved like a sister for more than 6 decades and felt something cold settle in my chest. Beatrice, you didn't just steal from me. I've found 17 other victims, 17 other elderly people you and your network robbed, manipulated, and destroyed. Some of them are dead, actually dead, not just legally dead. Did you kill them too? I never killed anyone. The protest came too quickly, too desperately, maybe not with your own hands. But you killed their spirits, their independence, and their dignity. You convinced them they were worthless, useless, and better off forgotten. How many people died thinking they were losing their minds when they were actually losing their lives to you? Beatrice was crying now, but they were tears of self-pity, not remorse. You don't understand what it's like to get old with nothing. To watch your children ignore you, to feel invisible, to realize that no one cares if you live or die. I understand perfectly. The difference is, I didn't decide to destroy other people's lives because I was unhappy with my own. What do you want from me, Florence? Apologies? Repentance? I can't undo what's been done. What I want, I said, standing up and walking to the window that overlooked the Portland skyline my stolen money had purchased for her, is for you to understand that you didn't just steal my possessions. You stole my trust in human nature. You stole my ability to believe that 60 years of friendship meant something. You stole my faith that the people who claim to love us won't destroy us when it becomes convenient. Florence, I also want you to know that it's over. All of it. Your network, your operation, your ability to prey on vulnerable people. Because in about 30 seconds, FBI agents are going to come through that door and arrest you for organized fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. Beatrice's eyes widened. You're working with the FBI. I'm working with justice, Beatrice. Something you apparently never learned the meaning of. Right on cue, there was a sharp knock at the door. FBI, open up! Agent Chen and her team entered with weapons drawn, moving with practiced efficiency. As they placed Beatrice in handcuffs, she looked at me with an expression of complete bewilderment. I loved you, she said as they led her toward the door. Everything I did because I loved you. I watched my oldest friend, my former friend, my betrayer, my would-be murderer, being taken away to face justice for crimes that had destroyed dozens of lives. No, Beatrice, I said quietly, though I doubt she heard me over the sound of her own sobbing. Everything you did because you never learned how to love anyone but yourself. The trials took 2 years. 2 years of testimony, evidence presentation, and watching the systematic destruction of 17 lives laid out in excruciating detail for judges and juries. Beatrice Williams was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for elder fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. At 73, it was effectively a life sentence. Robert Kim got 20 years for document forgery and mail fraud. Patricia Nurse received 15 years for impersonating medical professionals. James Rivera, Diana Foster, and Marcus Webb each received sentences ranging from 10 to 18 years. The network that had stolen more than $30 million from vulnerable elderly people was finally dismantled, but the damage they'd caused couldn't be undone with prison sentences. Of the 17 victims we'd identified, 6 had died during the investigation, some from natural causes hastened by the stress of discovering their betrayal, others under circumstances that remained suspicious but unprovable. The 11 survivors, including me, faced the daunting task of rebuilding lives that had been systematically destroyed by people they'd trusted. For my part, I recovered most of my financial assets. The house in Salem, the money Beatrice had stolen, and the investments that had been made with my funds, all of it was returned through the criminal restitution process. I was, in practical terms, wealthier than I'd been before the fraud, since the investments Beatrice's network had made with stolen money had actually performed well. But money was the easy part to recover. Trust, friendship, and faith in human nature, those were more complicated. I moved back to Salem, to a small condo near my old neighborhood, but not to the house where I'd lived with Gerald. That house held too many memories of Beatrice, too many moments of what I'd thought was friendship, but now understood was reconnaissance. Margaret Chen, the woman who'd bought it, was actually innocent. She'd purchased it legitimately, not knowing it was part of a fraud scheme. I didn't have the heart to disrupt her life for crimes she hadn't committed. The hardest part of recovery was learning to trust people again. For 62 years, Beatrice had been my closest friend, the person I'd confided in about everything, the one I'd called when I needed help or advice or just someone to talk to. Discovering that she'd been systematically betraying me for years, possibly decades, made me question every relationship I'd ever had. How do you make new friends at 84 when you've learned that even lifelong friendship can be an elaborate lie? How do you open your heart to people when you know that vulnerability can be weaponized against you? The answer, I discovered, was gradually and with great caution, but still with hope. I began volunteering at the local library, helping with literacy programs and research assistance. It felt good to be useful again, to use skills I'd developed over decades of professional work. The other volunteers were people of various ages who'd chosen to spend their free time helping others learn and grow. It was harder to imagine them as predators when they were giving their time rather than trying to take mine. I also became involved with an organization called Elder Justice Advocates, working with other fraud survivors to educate seniors about the warning signs of financial exploitation. Speaking at senior centers and community groups, I shared my story as a cautionary tale, but also as a story of survival and recovery. Most importantly, I learned to distinguish between healthy caution and paranoid isolation. Beatrice had convinced me that I needed to withdraw from the world for my own protection. Now I understood that engagement with the world, maintained thoughtfully and with appropriate boundaries, was actually protective. Isolation made me vulnerable. Connection made me strong. 3 years after my resurrection, I received a letter that changed my perspective on everything that had happened. The letter was from Dorothy Walsh, the 85-year-old woman who'd been Beatrice's next intended victim. Because federal agents had arrested the network before they could complete their fraud against her, Dorothy had kept her home, her independence, and her life savings. Dear Mrs. Whitmore, the letter read, I will never be able to thank you adequately for saving my life. When the FBI agents explained what was about to happen to me, how I was being targeted by people who wanted to convince me I was losing my mind so they could steal everything I owned, I realized that my life had been saved by someone I'd never met. I've been thinking about how many other elderly people you saved by exposing this network. People who will never know their names were on a list somewhere, who will never realize how close they came to losing everything. You didn't just save your own life. You saved dozens of lives, possibly hundreds. I hope you know that what you survived and what you accomplished matters far beyond your own recovery. You turned your betrayal into protection for others. You turned your pain into purpose. Reading Dorothy's letter, I finally understood why I'd survived what Beatrice had done to me. Not just survived, but thrived, recovered, and become stronger than I'd been before the betrayal. I'd learned that real friendship can't be stolen because it's based on mutual respect and genuine care. What Beatrice and I had wasn't friendship. It was a 60-year manipulation disguised as friendship. Real friendship doesn't require you to diminish yourself to make the other person feel important. Real friendship doesn't ask you to surrender your independence in exchange for care. I'd learned that trust, once broken, can be rebuilt, but it has to be rebuilt wisely. I couldn't let Beatrice's betrayal make me so suspicious that I'd never connect with anyone again. But I also couldn't be so naive that I'd ignore red flags in future relationships. Most importantly, I'd learned that surviving betrayal isn't just about recovering what was stolen. It's about becoming someone who can't be stolen from again. Not because you're paranoid or isolated, but because you know your own worth and won't accept less than you deserve. At 86 now, I have friends who value me for who I am, not what I can provide them. I have purpose in my work protecting other seniors from financial exploitation. I have peace in knowing that the people who tried to destroy me are facing justice for their crimes. Beatrice Williams stole 62 years of what I thought was friendship. But in doing so, she taught me the difference between real connection and elaborate deception, between love and exploitation, and between trust and gullibility. I wouldn't wish what happened to me on anyone, but I'm grateful for what it taught me, that it's never too late to start over, never too late to build authentic relationships, and never too late to discover your own strength. Sometimes the worst betrayal leads to the best recovery. Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you had to discover everything you actually need. At 86, I'm finally living authentically, surrounded by people who see my worth rather than my vulnerability. It took catching my best friend stealing my life to learn how to build a life worth living, and that perhaps is its own form of justice. Thank you for listening to today's story from Granny Story Corner. Life teaches us lessons in the most unexpected ways, doesn't it? If this story touched your heart, please subscribe for more real-life tales that remind us of our shared humanity. Until next time, may your own story be filled with wisdom and love.